Hi, welcome back. Previous lesson was on the power of prices. Today we'll be looking at externalities. So what are externalities? So externalities refer to unintended side effects or consequences of an economic activity that affect third parties who are not directly involved in the activity. So, the simplest example of this is when you consume or produce a good that has positive or negative benefit on someone else, and you are not compensating the person, or the person is not paying you for that positive or negative benefit. That is externality. Now, we will look at some examples of externalities later in this lesson. So, externalities are important because they lead to market failure, which is producing inefficient outcome that aren't in society's best interest. So remember, market failure is when production is not at the equilibrium level. So anything that leads to underproduction or overproduction, aside from what the best outcome is for the market, that is market failure. Now let's look at types of externalities. So the first type of externality that we have is negative externality. So a negative externality is a side effect of an economic activity that hurts third parties that are not being compensated for this cost to them. So an example is the exhaust pipe that comes from your tailpipe when you drive. Now, this is a negative externality because it causes harm to others who breathe in that pollution. So, negative externality, it imposes cost on other people. So, anytime you drive, there may be exhaust coming from your tailpipe, and that can be polluting the environment. And people that breathe in this exhaust, this can be harmful to their health because you are not compensating them for this cost on their health. This is what we call a negative externality. Another example is if you smoke and this you as a result of you smoking a cigarette, other people's health are harmed because they are bystanders who are taking in the smoke coming from your cigarette. This is also negative externality. Or another example is if you own a beehive and then some people are allergic to the bee in your neighborhood, and this is causing a reaction or harming their health, and you are not compensating them for it. That is a negative externality. So any activity that you partake in that causes a negative side effect to someone else that you do not pay for that cost, that is negative externality. So negative externality leads to market failure because people often make decisions without fully accounting for the cost that these decisions impose on others. So as a result, they often consume more of these goods or produce more of these goods than what would be in society's best interest. So if people were being forced to pay for every cost that their consumption or production of a good has on society, they will in turn consume less of these goods than they are at the moment. Now, another example of externality is positive externality. Now, a positive externality is a side effect of an economic activity that benefits third parties, and you are not being compensated for that benefit that you are providing to the society. An example is when you get a vaccine, for instance, COVID, you get a COVID vaccine. It's not just to protect yourself, but also you stand a chance of protecting others because you will now be less likely to infect them. So people now benefit from you getting the COVID vaccine. And then another example of positive externality is if we look back at the beehive. Now, the beehive can have a positive effect on others by also pollinating their flowers. So your neighbors can benefit from you owning a beehive because their flowers will be pollinated by the bees. This is a positive effect of you having a beehive on your neighbors that they are not compensating you for. So positive externalities generate benefit to others. They lead to market failure because people make decisions without fully accounting for the positive effect that their activities are having on others. So as a result, they'll do less of these things than is socially useful. So if you are not being compensated for the positive effect your activities having on the society, then you are not incentivized to do more of it, and because of that you may do less of it than required by society. So now let's move on to the conflict between private interest and society's interest. Now, externality creates a difference between what an individual considers optimal and then what is optimal from society's perspective. So it creates something that is more like a tension between private and society's interest. So your private interest is all about the costs and benefits to you personally. So when you consume any good or you produce any good, your private interest is the cost to you that is involved in the production of the good, or the benefits that you as a person get from consumption or production of that good. But society's interest may be slightly different when we think about externalities. So society's interest includes all costs and benefits, whether they are accrued to you or to others. So the simplest way of saying this is, from society's perspective, the cost of producing a good or the benefit of consumption or producing a good is not just the cost to the producer or to the individual. It's also how that activity affects other people. So the cost to a third party or the benefit to a third party. Society considers all of that when they talk about optimal production or consumption of a good. So if your choices do not affect others in any way, there's no positive or negative effect of your choices on others, then it means that your private cost or benefit is exactly society's cost or benefit, because there's no external effect anywhere. But when your action affects bystanders, then there is a conflict between your private interest and society's interest, and that can lead to market failure. Now, let's just explore how externalities shape the decisions that sellers and buyers make. So, if we look at this graph, so we are looking at negative externality from the production side. So, we have a seller's marginal cost of production, and then we have society's cost of production. So, on the vertical axis, we have marginal cost, and then on the horizontal axis, we have the quantity that you produce or you consume. So a seller's private cost is the cost of producing the good. So in this case, this is a seller's private cost of production. But this seller's private cost can be different from society's cost. Now, society's cost is not just taking into consideration the cost of production to that seller, it's also taking into consideration the external cost, which in this case we are calling externalities. So, for instance, if the production of this good leads to pollution, which affects other people negatively. So this is a negative effect that the producer is not taking into account, but society takes into account this cost of production. So if society adds this cost of production to the seller's private cost, then we end up at the marginal social cost. So marginal social cost in this case will be the seller's individual private cost plus the external cost. So whatever it costs the seller to produce the good, plus the external cost that this is having on other people. So what we are saying here is a seller's private cost. It just refers to the extra cost that the seller incurs when they produce 1 unit of the good, and this is represented on this curve. But there are other costs that the seller doesn't bear, like the harm that the cause due to pollution. And these are what we call the external costs. So these are represented by external marginal cost. Now, if the society takes this cost into consideration, then that moves us to marginal social cost. So when sellers ignore the marginal external cost, It means that their supply curves simply reflect only the marginal private cost. But from society's perspective, both the marginal external and private cost are relevant. Hence, society's marginal cost is going to be equal to the marginal external cost, which is the external cost on third parties that producers are not taking into account, plus the marginal private cost to that producer. Now, if you look at these two curves, you can see that the society's cost lies above the seller's private cost. So this means that society, so for instance, if the seller's marginal cost is 20, and then the external cost, so the externality to the environment or pollution or whatever cost this production has on society is maybe 10, society is now going to add that external cost to the private cost. So that increases it to 30. So from society's perspective, if there is negative externality involved in the production or consumption of a good, the cost is always higher than what producers actually have in mind. If people were being forced to actually pay for the society's cost, that is going to reduce the consumption of that good and maybe lead to a more efficient production. Now let's look at positive externality, looking at it from the consumption of the good or from the consumer side. Now, just like we did for the cost of production or the negative externality, a buyer's decision is guided by extra benefits that accrue to them, and these are called the marginal private cost. So for any person, your demand curve usually shows the benefit that you get from consumption of a good. So if the benefit is high, then you're willing to pay more or you're willing to buy more of the good. So when you consume any good, this curve shows the benefit or your private benefit from the consumption of a good. But if there are other benefits from the production or the consumption of the good, which you do not account for, then it means that what society considers the benefit of the good is different from what the individual is going to consider as the benefit from the good. So just like we had for the negative externality, we can also have a similar thing for the positive externality. If there is any positive effect of the consumption of the good that you are not taking into account, this is called external benefit. And they are called external benefits because they are accrued to people external to the decision that generates them. So as I said, the demand curve in this case, it corresponds with buyer's marginal private benefit. So the demand curve will show the private benefits that you get from the consumption of any good. But from society's perspective, both the private benefit plus the external benefit, which is the benefit on third parties, this should be taken into account when you're calculating the total benefit of the consumption of a good. So society doesn't just consider the private benefit, it also now includes the external benefit. So for instance, your COVID vaccination, the benefit to you is that you yourself are less likely to get infected. But the external benefit is now you cannot infect other people. So society takes that benefit also into account, which leads to the marginal social benefit. So when we're looking at the demand curve for the private person and then the society, you can see that the society's demand curve lies above the private demand curve. This is because society's benefit from the consumption of the good is higher than what the individual is taking into account. So this happens because people ignore the external benefits that their consumption of the good is having on other people. So they tend to consume less of the good than what is optimal for society. So if you look at the marginal social benefit, you find that it is the marginal private benefit plus the marginal external benefit. So this is all that we have on our lesson on externalities. Our next lesson will be on public goods and the free rider problem. If you enjoyed today's lesson, consider subscribing. Thank you.